Welcome to this evening's Harper Lecture, Protests and Pandemics, featuring Professor Susan Stokes. I'm Tom Priebe, Senior Associate Director for International Advancement. On behalf of the UChicago Alumni Office, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I would like to note a few housekeeping items. There will be 3 people speaking today. You will hear me, Professor Stokes, and our moderator, Kevin Cromach. All other participants will be muted. However, we would like you to participate by asking questions. To do that, type a question in the Q&A box at any time during the talk. If you have issues with audio, you may want to shut down programs running in the background or dial in from your phone. Our presentation will last for 60 minutes today. Professor Stokes will speak, and then we should have 20 minutes for questions from you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available to you on the Harper Lecture YouTube channel. A link will be sent to you in a follow-up email. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Kevin Cromach. Kevin is the Senior Research Associate at the Chicago Center on Democracy, where he directs all aspects of the center's operations, including strategy, research, fundraising, and communications. Kevin draws from experience in both the academic and corporate worlds to build the center into a world-class institution that helps resilient democratic institutions to thrive around the world. I will now turn it over to Kevin.
Great, thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone, thanks for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Susan Stokes for today's Harper Lecture. Professor Stokes is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor in Political Science at the University of Chicago. She's also the Faculty Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, which was launched at UChicago in 2018 with the aim to strengthen democracy through research, discussion, and building a community among those interested in democracy. Professor Stokes has deep research experience in many aspects of democracy. Her publication history, which includes 5 books, a number of edited volumes, and a long list of articles and book chapters, covers a truly diverse set of topics, though all around a common theme of how democracy as a political system functions, especially in developing societies. These topics that she's studied include social movements, neoliberalism, clientelism, referendums, and of course, protests, which is the topic of today's conversation. Her most recent book is called Why Bother? Rethinking Participation in Elections and Protests. The book tackles an extremely timely question, which is, given that both voting and participating in protests demand costs of the participants, which can be extremely high in certain contexts, seemingly without a lot of personal benefit, why do people still make the effort and take the risks to vote and to protest? So I will now turn it over to Professor Stokes to share her views on this and related questions. So Professor Stokes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you, Tom, as well. And thanks to all of you who are out there. I wish I could see you. It's really exciting to be here tonight. I'm happy to be talking about this topic. And you know, we're all getting used to new ways of communicating our research and our concerns. So here we are on this interesting journey together. As Kevin mentioned, the book that I just co-authored with a young Turkish scholar named Erdem Aytaç is called Why Bother? Rethinking Participation in Elections and Protests. I'll be speaking mostly about protests today, but a little bit about elections. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen the cover of the forthcoming Spanish version of the book, Para qué molestarse, which is coming out with Siglo XXI editores in Argentina, hopefully early next year. And then in the middle of the screen, there's the Turkish version, which is also out. I can't for the life of me say the title in Turkish, and I assume that it's not going to do much good for any of you, but there it is. We're very proud of it. So Kevin did a great job of introducing the basic kind of puzzle of the book. And let me just focus on that for a moment, because that's really what the lecture is going to focus on as well. So when we think about collective political action, the kinds of actions that we're asked to do together, that we do together in political life, the objectives of those actions are in a real sense usually public goods. They're goods that, I'm going to remind you a little bit more about this later in the lecture, but basically they're goods that we benefit from whether or not we participated in getting them, in securing them. And also, since these are mass actions, our own individual action won't probably add that much to one side or the other winning the election or the government conceding our demands or not. So there aren't strong individual incentives to take part, and participation is very costly. And so the expectation might be, from that perspective, that not many people would vote, particularly in systems in which voting is not mandatory, not compulsory. And also the expectation that protests would be very small, that very few people would bother, as our title says, to go out into the streets and get involved in protests. So the key idea that Erdem and I developed, and that I'm going to kind of develop over the course of the lecture, is that just as there are costs of participation, just as it's costly, burdensome to participate in collective action, so there are also costs of abstention. Costs involved or burdens involved in not going out, not voting, not protesting, not getting involved in other collective actions in politics. And I'll say more in a few minutes about what I mean by the costs of abstention. Now, it's a very appropriate moment in history to consider why people take part in collective action. This last 15 years or so have really been kind of a golden age of street protests and demonstrations. And I'm going to talk in a moment about the factors that scholars think lie behind that high rate, the sort of growth of protest actions around the world. But let me just start by giving you some examples. So this is an image of Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt in January 2011. As you'll recall, this is toward the beginning of what we later came to know as the Arab Spring. Egypt was very much an autocratic and rather repressive society, government, and therefore there was a lot of reason not to go out and join protest movements. But you can see from the image here is just striking, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people on the streets protesting nevertheless. The Arab Spring and the Arab world have been host to many protests. Earlier in 2009, there were mass protests in Iran after what was seen as a stolen election. In a little before the Tahrir Square and the Cairo protests, there were protests in Tunisia and smaller ones in Morocco, and later in Algeria. Several massive uprisings took place simultaneously in 2013. So I'm moving ahead a couple of years now in this important sort of decade or so. This is an image from Taksim Square, which is in central Istanbul. Some of you may recall that there was a protest that revolved around a park that's located in the middle of Taksim Square. The Erdogan government had planned to bulldoze over the park, take down the trees, and with the Taksim Square, turn it into a shopping mall and mosque complex. The protests against the events in Gezi Park and the government's plans really became extremely large. As you can see, again, it's kind of an image not reminiscent of what we saw in Tahrir Square. And this spread to other Turkish cities as well. So sort of major national uprising in 2013. Now I'm going to fast forward us a little bit. Actually, almost the exact same moment. This is Brazil also in June of 2013, almost exactly the same time as the Gezi Park uprising. These were protests that were sparked by an announced increase in public transit fares. They very quickly became very large over a short period of time. And they were Sao Paulo, Rio, and several other Brazilian cities. Some of you may recall these protests, and there have been other protests in Brazil around the pro and against the Dilma Rousseff impeachment and other protests in Brazil. Now let's fast forward just about 6 months to the Northern Hemisphere winter of 2013-2014. This is Kiev, Ukraine. This is Maidan Square. This was a protest that again started in in the capital city in this case, and then spread, became very large, and in fact, and went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and ended with the fleeing of then President Yanukovych to Russia and the fall of his government. Now I'll take you ahead to a few years to last year, to 2019. 2019 was an astonishing year in terms of the frequency and size and just regional spread of protests around the world. So this map just highlights some of the countries, and you can see across the world regions where major protests took part. Those are the countries that are highlighted in purple. We had protests in streets and squares from Ecuador to Tehran, Santiago to Beirut, Delhi to Paris, and beyond. Now, some of these movements in 2019 were sparked by kind of pocketbook issues, a spike in taxes in Lebanon, gas price increases in Iran, public transit fare increases announced in Chile, more general economic grievances in France and in Colombia. Now, sometimes politics what provided the spark for protests. So think about elections or perceptions of stolen elections in Russia and Bolivia. Passage of unpopular laws was a spark of protests in 2019. That occurred in Hong Kong, and it occurred in India. And also the revelation of deep corruption. That led to major protests in Iraq last year. Sometimes government inaction was also actually the reasons for protests. Think about the protests in the United States for government inaction on gun violence, or protests around the world bringing attention to and calling for more action of governments on climate change. So protests grew in intensity in roughly a decade between 2009, when they broke out in Iran, and 2019, last year. Why was that? What are some of the factors that lie behind this acceleration of protests? Let me just mention a few. So these are things that scholars of protests believe have been in the background in a way behind particular protests, which, as I've just mentioned, break out for a variety of sort of proximate reasons. One factor that does seem to be important is increased income inequality. Income and wealth inequalities have persisted and worsened in many regions. There's a recent report by the UN Development Program that indicates that a majority of households in developing countries live in societies where income inequality is worse now, or worse in 2019 when the report came out, than it was in the 1990s. And the people who are already at the very top of the income distribution benefit from periods of economic growth. So when there is growth in countries in the developing world, that growth, the benefits of that growth tend to focus on people who are already quite wealthy. The UN warns that if these kinds of current trends continue, the top 0.1% of the population in wealth terms will command the same, as much wealth as the middle 40% of the world's population. So there's a sense of growing inequality which provides a kind of heightened level of grievance in many countries. Another factor is what's known as the democratic deficit. In countries that are formally democratic, and especially in new democracies, the public has often been kind of disappointed by the performance of those democracies, disappointed by corruption, incompetence, and lackluster economic results. So there was a poll that was conducted in a bunch of different countries where they asked citizens about how satisfied they were with the performance of their democracies. This was last year, so this is before the pandemic. In Mexico, 85% of citizens said they were not satisfied with the way democracy works in their country. 83% of Brazilians, 70% of Tunisians, 64% of South Africans, 63% of Argentines are likewise unimpressed, dissatisfied with democratic performance. This kind of discontent with democracy has increased over time in many countries, and pessimism about economic opportunities and frustration with elected officials is related strongly to dissatisfaction about the way democracy works. Now, there's a third factor that I'm just going to mention briefly because I'll talk more about it later, and that is the digital revolution. For a number of reasons, we think that the crescendo of protests around the world since roughly 2009 was fed in some ways by two aspects of the digital revolution. One of them was the rise of social media, and I'm sure that's fairly intuitive for you. And another is rather more specific but interesting, and that is the proliferation of cell phones with cameras. And I'll say more in a moment about how to interpret the impact of those two aspects of the digital revolution on the rise of protest actions. Let's go back for a moment to the idea that people make cost-benefit calculations in deciding whether to get involved in protests. If they looked at this question from a purely individual perspective, the cost would basically always outweigh the benefits. This is because, as I mentioned before, the benefits from collective action in politics are almost always what social scientists call public goods. You can't be excluded from public goods whether or not you participated in producing them. In more technical terms, public goods are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption, the latter meaning if I breathe fresh air, that clean air, that doesn't keep you from breathing clean air. So we're not competing for the consumption of these goods. So given that when people protest, and for that matter, when they go out to vote, they're presumably trying to achieve something that's a public good, and their actions are costly, why do they do it? Why do they bother, as the title of our book says? So to give you sort of, and I will answer that question in a moment, but to give you a sort of a more of a sense of this, here's Hong Kong. I'm sure many of you are aware Hong Kong has been an epicenter of protests in 2019 and in earlier years as well. This is an image from a protest in Hong Kong in August of 2019. And the headline from the news report that goes with this picture says, Hong Kong protesters show no sign of backing down in the face of countless threats. And the article went on, and I quote, despite heavy rain, threats from Beijing, and weeks of clashes with police, nearly 2 million protesters marched through the streets of Hong Kong on Sunday for the 11th weekend in a row. So in other words, the picture you're seeing is the 11th time that there were massive protests in Hong Kong, despite all of those impediments and actually risks. In a traditional cost-benefit analysis, Hong Kongers would have said to themselves, the costs of protesting are some likelihood of getting rained on, some likelihood of getting tear gassed, maybe even arrested. And the benefits to me are, as an individual Hong Konger, are minuscule. My own participation, even if I care a lot about, say, eliminating a proposed extradition agreement between Hong Kong and mainland China, or more recently, if I'm concerned about a new security law and I want it from Beijing and I want it to be reversed, my participation in the protest isn't going to make it much of a difference. There's not going to be any visible difference in whether they're successful. And if those ends are achieved, I will benefit whether or not I took part. So something else must be going on, because obviously we see 2 million Hong Kongers taking part. To add another fact that goes against a simple cost-benefit approach, it's not infrequent that when participants get treated harshly by police, when they do face tear gas or batons or truncheons or rubber bullets from the police, people who have been sitting on the sidelines and not protesting frequently join in. So presumably police repression increases the cost of participation, but nevertheless that kind of increased cost can be followed by actually increased participation, not reduced participation. That's a phenomenon that social movement scholars describe as backlash, a backlash dynamic or backlash movements, and these are not uncommon. An example Here again, we're back in Istanbul in 2013. So this was this was a picture taken on May 28th. This was at the very beginning of the protest. There was a group, very small group, about a dozen or so members of an ecological organization that opposed the felling of the trees in Gezi Park. They were camped out. They were sort of occupying the park, and the Istanbul police appeared and took their tents down and burned the tents, and they tear gassed them, they pepper sprayed them, and you can see this woman being pepper sprayed at close proximity. This picture was taken by a Reuters journalist and photojournalist, and it immediately went viral. This person became famous, even though nobody knew for a long time what her name was, but she became the girl in red or the woman in red, and many people in Turkey saw this image. So again, you might think that an image of somebody getting tear gassed like this or pepper sprayed like this might turn people away from protests, but instead the demonstrations became massive, and they not only became massive in Istanbul over a period of just a small number of days, they spread to other cities, Ankara, Izmir, and this became kind of a national uprising. This backlash dynamic is not uncommon and was at work in Brazil's anti-bus fare increase protests, which I mentioned earlier happened about the same time as the Gezi Park uprising. The Euromaidan protests in Ukraine began. There was a protest on November 29th, 2013, when Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, backed away from signing an association agreement with the European Union. And Ukrainians who were in favor of Ukraine entering an association agreement with the EU turned out to protest in the Maidan. There were only a few people left early in the morning of November 30th, and a special police force called the Berkut came out into the square and started beating the lingering protesters with batons. By the way, that was very unusual for Ukraine. Usually the police don't treat protesters so heavy-handedly. And again, as you saw from the previous image, the effect of that was not to shrink the protests, but to make them grow enormously. So why is it frequently the case that costs of protesting go up and demonstrations surge? So theorists are not at all wrong to consider costs as a factor in participation decisions, the costs of participating. But they think about these costs in a one-sided way. Just as there are costs of participation, so there are also costs of abstention. Costs of participation tend to be material, getting a bus fare, spending the time necessary to get where you need to go. Costs of abstention are more psychological, but they're no less real for that. And a lot of what Erdem and I have tried very hard to do in our book is to offer evidence, very hard evidence, good hard social science evidence, that costs of participation, costs of abstention, even though in a sense you don't see them, are very real and play a real role in people's behavior. So to give us a quick sense of the intuition behind the costs of abstention, I worry about climate change, as I'm sure many of you do as well. I worry about my family's wasting fossil fuels and contributing to greenhouse gases. And when my husband and I are driving, if he's driving and I'm in the passenger seat and we stop somewhere and we stop for a period and he leaves the car idling, I get a feeling of discomfort and almost approaching kind of a physical pain, and I want to reach over and turn the car off. Now, that would be a costly action. And if you don't understand that would be a costly action, if my husband is in the car, you probably have not been in a long-term relationship. It's not that I stop and engage in moral reflection and say, I should act inconsistently with how I would want other people to act if I want social outcomes to be the kind I prefer. Although if I did engage in that moral reflection, I would probably end up in the same place. But this is a much more instantaneous kind of almost a kind of mood shift, or a kind of an automatic sense of discomfort, moral distress, kind of a negative tension that I experience, and I think people often experience in that kind of situation. So keeping in mind costs of participation and of abstention helps clarify the impact of the digital revolution on protest frequency. With the invention of social media, the cost of organizing protests declined. With social media, it's almost costless for organizers to send out a message, make a post saying, everyone meet at 6 p.m. in the square. By the same token, for would-be participants, it's very low cost to find out where to go, what's happening, when. So the cost of that aspect of the cost of participation declined with the social media. I mentioned earlier that also the proliferation of cell phone cameras. Basically, with cell phones, smartphones that so many of us have, and which have cameras, we're all turned into kind of amateur photojournalists. And it's very easy to capture images and capture audio of acts of police repression, actions of social injustice that are bothersome to us and that we could post and that will have an effect, a kind of reverberation, and may lead to either spontaneous or organized mobilization. So the costs of participation are falling, the costs of abstention are rising. So little wonder that after more or less 2009, we've seen an acceleration of street protests around the world. Now, the costs of abstention aren't just rational. I've mentioned that emotions are very much involved. A powerful emotion is anger and moral outrage. Anger is what psychologists call an approach emotion. And by approach emotion, what they mean is emotions that make us want to be around other people, want to get involved, sort of want to be in other people's faces, as opposed to withdrawal, what psychologists call withdrawal emotions, like sadness and fear, that tend to make us want to withdraw, to stay at home, to seek solace and safety. I think a lot of us have been feeling a lot of withdrawal emotions in recent months. I said earlier that people often react to other protesters being treated harshly by the police, not by staying home, but by joining protests. And I've tried to explain why that's true. But how do we know that that's actually true? So I'm not going to spend much time talking about the kind of research methods that Erdem and I undertook and the kind of evidence we have, but I'll just mention a few things. One is that we engaged in interviewing people and also made use of surveys from a number of countries around the world. This is the result of a survey that was taken in the Maidan Square in Kiev during the protests. The Kiev International Institute of Sociology undertook these surveys, and they asked people, they simply asked them to tell them the reasons why they were in the square, why they were protesting. And what's interesting here is that you can see that the most commonly mentioned reason that people mentioned was repression, referring back to that early morning November 30th attack on the protesters by the Berkut that I mentioned earlier. And that's actually mentioned more frequently than Yanukovych's refusal to enter the association agreement with the EU, which was the explicit reason for the protests in the first place. By the way, people were allowed to mention more than one reason why they were there, and that's why those numbers don't sum to 100%. We were able to use both interviews and experimental techniques to find out, to go a little deeper into the reasons why repression had the effect that it did, to be able to see exactly what was going on with people when they said things like, well, the reason I'm out here is because I was bothered by seeing the police attack protesters. We interviewed again, in fact, we had someone interviewed on our behalf because we don't speak, neither Erdem nor I speak Russian or Ukrainian. We had an interview took place with a very interesting man who had somebody who had never been involved in politics before, but got involved. In fact, he organized, he was a member of a sort of car enthusiast group, an automobile enthusiast or club, and he kind of got involved in changing the nature of that club so that it became opportunity to ferry protesters back and forth to the Maidan during the protests, which went on for several months. His name is Dmitry Bulatov, and the interview with him is really interesting because it sort of says something about what I've been talking about in terms of costs of abstention. He learned from a friend who had been in Maidan Square on November 30th and had seen the repression by the police, by the Berkut, and he let Dmitry know about it. He said, the police were attempting to take this girl toward a police vehicle, whereas my friend tried to rescue her from the police and take her toward an ambulance because she had been beaten and was covered in blood. Only then I turned on the television, opened the internet, and speaking honestly and plainly, I became enraged. You know, there are sometimes moments when you feel like you are coming apart because it's no longer possible to tolerate the situation. And that's when he phoned his friends and started this Auto-Maidan organization. So he's speaking much more eloquently than I was earlier about this inner tension, the sense of rage. He talks about it in terms of feeling like you're coming apart and you can no longer tolerate being inactive and you're sort of spurred to action. So if we keep in mind that people weigh costs of participation, but also costs of abstention when they decide to take part in collective actions, this helps explain the course of collective action during the pandemic. So recall this map. This was the map that shows you where there were sort of lots of protests in 2019 all over the globe. Now, if we redrew this map, recolored it in 2020, in the first months of 2020, the whole map basically would have gone to gray. Very little protest activity. Even in Hong Kong, protests pretty much came to a halt in the first months of 2020. And I don't think that will surprise you. People who earlier had been out on the streets were now following stay-at-home orders from their governments, and they were also fearful of the possibility of the virus spreading in large gatherings. This severe dip in protest activity might seem like a vindication of a simple cost-benefit approach to why people protest. After all, the cost of protesting went up really sharply all of a sudden, and people stayed home. But if this were the whole story, we wouldn't expect any upticks in protest activity during the pandemic. But we have seen such upticks. So again, back to Hong Kong, with the passage of the new security law by Beijing, protests began again in July. The law made people, especially young Hong Kongers, very angry, and their cost of abstention, I would say, surged. For many of them, it went high enough to overcome costs of participation, which also had gone up because of the new threats of very harsh consequences for protesters. Now, it's also true that by July, the pandemic had eased in Hong Kong, and so maybe you could say, well, that might be a reason why there was an uptick in protest. Well, let me take you now to another place where there has been persistent high rates of coronavirus infections, unfortunately, and protests, and won't surprise you to hear that that's the United States. Now we're looking at an image of people lined up to vote. So this is about voting. Remember, I said that our theory really applies to voting in non-mandatory systems as well as to protests. And you can almost see the cost of participation in this picture. Look at the masks people are wearing, trying to protect themselves from the virus. Very long lines waiting to get into the polling place. But what you can't see are the costs of abstention. And what I'm saying is that they're real, even though we don't see them in the same way. So what were the costs of abstention? Well, many large swaths of the American electorate were quite angry at the political leadership in the country, more so with the sense that the response to the pandemic had been mishandled. And then there were a series of problems with the elections that made it that much harder to vote in Wisconsin, so that people really were almost taking their lives in their hands to go out to vote. Nevertheless, many of them did. And they told journalists that they were voting kind of because they were angry and as almost an act of defiance. So we've had protests as well in the midst of the pandemic. As I'm sure you're aware, on May 31st, George Floyd, an African-American man, was killed by a white police officer, and we've seen enormous protest activity in response to that event, which again was captured on many cell phone videos, and the videos of that event were very mobilizing. Add to that the police response in some settings has been rather harsh against protesters, and that is almost a perfect storm. So even though the cost of participation in these protests is very high rates of police actions and high rates of infection, still people are coming out. And what you see is that wall of moms that's in Portland, Oregon. The haziness that you see in the picture is tear gas. So the moms are wearing they're wearing goggles and masks to protect themselves from the virus, but also from tear gas. So I will end with an image of a different kind of pandemic mobilization. This is in Berlin about a week ago, and this was a protest against the public health restrictions that the German government was imposing to try to deal with the pandemic. This is just a way of showing that there are even the same kind of situation can give rise to lots of different kinds of versions of what grievances are, and those grievances can be quite mobilizing. So just to finish up, I've to make sense of people's participation in collective political action, like elections or protests, we should, of course, consider the costs that they face in getting involved. That's a very important factor. But we also need to consider another kind of cost, the cost of abstention, the cost of staying away, the psychological, moral, and social burdens of staying away and staying home when people care a lot about the goals of social action and about injustices. Very high costs of participation on their own encourage people to stay away, as they did in the first months of the pandemic. But very high costs of abstention can overcome those costs of participation and bring people out into the streets. A worldwide crescendo of social mobilization in 2019 suddenly came to a crashing halt in early 2020. When the cost of abstention increased as well, some people were willing to take part in collective political action, voting and demonstrating. Fear of the virus raised the cost of participation, but anger at social injustice and police abuse raised the cost of abstention. Which costs will accelerate faster in the coming months will determine whether 2020 becomes a year of quiescence or a year of mobilization. So thank you very much for listening, and I will now turn things over to bring in Kevin, and we can have a question and answer.
Great, wonderful. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you. I think it's a really fascinating way of explaining this phenomenon of protesting. You know, this sort of push and pull between the costs of abstention and the cost of participation. I want to focus. I'll first say that we have a number of questions that have come in, but if anyone has other questions you'd like to submit, please do so through the Q&A now. We can probably still get some that have not been submitted. On that push and pull of abstention and participation costs, I want to focus on the government or police response protests. You know, there's certainly a threshold there where if the government response is repressive enough, the cost of participation go so high that people don't show up. And so one of our attendees asked a question around when you were showing that woman in red in Gezi Park, you know, the pepper spray to the face. You would think that would be kind of over that line. You know, people who are looking at that would say, I don't want to go and be treated the same way. So what kind of tactics have you seen kind of cross that line where it really keeps people away, and what kind of tactics seem mobilizing?
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks so much for that. What we've seen in our research is, and we have studied government responses, and one of the things that we see is that governments don't always, believe it or not, know what they're getting themselves into. So sometimes they do undertake acts of repression without anticipating that there will be a kind of backlash. And partly that's because protests are not, they're not a regularized part of, institutionalized part of politics. So sometimes governments are kind of ham-handed. It's also the case that if you think about, how did Erdogan respond or how did Rousseff respond, you think about politicians at the very high level, that's one thing, but there's also the phenomenon of kind of local police forces, which may or may not be entirely under the control of, line police forces, not necessarily under the control of these higher level, maybe perhaps more strategic thinkers. That was very much the dynamic in the civil rights movement, for example, in the United States in the 1960s, when you had local sheriffs' offices local sheriffs in the South kind of going over the top with repression, and that kind of building support for civil rights in other parts of the country. There are clearly instances where governments are successful in stamping out movements with very high levels of repression. And what we've seen in our research is, so you have governments kind of step in, impose a level of repression that makes a backlash happen. So all of a sudden you've got, it's sort of a national crisis. You've got people out on the streets everywhere. And one response by the government is to back off and to reduce the level of repression and to have more communication with protesters. And that can quiet things down. That was sort of what happened in Brazil. But another response is to up the level of repression, to go kind of crazy with the repression and stamp out the movement. And that's a little bit more what happened in Turkey. One of the ultimate kind of examples of successful repression of a very, very big social movement goes back to 1989 with the Tiananmen Square uprising, and that was simply repressed with military force. That is harder for democracies to pull off. There are lots of consequences, negative consequences under democracies when that happens. I think we're seeing a little bit of that now in Hong Kong as well. So full repression can kill a movement, although it can also encourage insurgency, which is another version of a kind of participation, which is quite different.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
A related question that came in, which is also sort of in that bucket of raising participation costs, is about rioting and looting. How does that fit into your framework? Do you see that as a factor that raises participation costs?
So that's a very interesting question. Honestly, I hadn't thought about it exactly that way, but what we do know about, so let's call it violent actions on the side of protesters, is that unless they are planning an insurgency and self-arming and that sort of path, which is quite different from the kind of protest that we've been looking at, though violence or rioting or even just sort of intense attacks on property can really backfire for them. So there's an excellent book by a political scientist named Dennis Chong about the US civil rights movement, and he describes this sort of strategic interaction between protesters and police forces, sheriff's offices, as a kind of public relations game, where you win if you get the other side to act in a more aggressive way and you're peaceful. So what that means is that often protest organizers have to be in the business of trying to control the more hot-headed people on their sides. And you do definitely see that kind of dynamic in many settings. And you often see a kind of competing narrative on the part of, sort of governments. We see this very much in the United States now. So when Attorney General Barr talks about protests, he inevitably talks about rioters, whereas the Black Lives Matter organizers are very insistent that they're peaceful, that they favor peaceful methods.
Great. Kind of taking a different tack, two questions came in that roughly correspond to the question of why you frame the reason people participate as reducing their abstention costs. Why not frame it as kind of an inherent reward. Does that seem like a difference to you to frame it that way, or is that just semantics?
You certainly could think of it as a reward for participating, and implicitly, when you kind of alleviate the costs of the sort of psychic tensions and costs of not participating, you're rewarded by a reduction in those costs. So to some extent, it's semantic. I think what we're trying to emphasize, what's really important, is the kind of different ways that costs of participation and costs of abstention operate. So costs of participation tend to get us to think, more rationally. We're thinking about, how much time is it going to take? What are my chances of getting into some kind of trouble? Whereas the cost of abstention, we're really trying to emphasize that this is a kind of a world of psychological responses. And Erdem and I, neither of us was particularly knowledgeable about political psychology before we started this project, but pretty soon when we got into the area of mass participation, it became clear to us that we were going to have to learn something about psychology. You certainly could. The question is right on the mark, in the sense that you could certainly talk about rewards from alleviating the cost of abstention. Yeah.
Right. Interesting question came in to kind of connect the two sides of your book, the voting and the protest side. Have you seen examples of voter suppression leading to the kind of galvanizing backlash that brings people to the streets?
We definitely have. And actually, when I was discussing the primary in Wisconsin and those voters in Milwaukee, that was, when they said they were angry, one of the things they were angry about was, I didn't talk about it in detail, but basically there was a kind of a fight between the Republican state legislature and the Democratic governor over mail-in balloting. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and I think it was the day before the primary, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the governor doesn't have the ability to say, yes, we can. The issue was whether they would accept mail-in ballots over a longer period of time, and that felt to people like a kind of act of suppression, that political actors were going out of their way to try to exclude them from voting. Now, we do discuss in the book earlier examples. So in the United States, as many of you will know, there have been a new series of very strict voter ID laws that came in after the U.S. Supreme Court sort of relaxed the regulation of voting in southern states. And those voter ID laws have been widely perceived as kind of behind backdoor efforts to suppress African American votes and low-income votes of low-income urban people. And what's interesting is the research has suggested that those laws have not been as effective as they were expected to be by as was hoped by the people who carried them out, and feared by the people who wanted to have sort of full electoral participation. And the reason is that there's a kind of it's sort of a two-way street. Again, it's sort of, yes, it becomes more costly to vote, but people get really angry that when they think that their group's participation is being withheld, that they're being blocked from voting, and that becomes a very good mobilization device. So sometimes you get extremely high rates of participation, people really going out of their way to try to vote in response to those kind of voter ID laws. Now, in the long run, those laws may end up being more effective, and time will tell. But in the short term, they really haven't been as effective as was anticipated.
Great. Another interesting question that came in that kind of takes a step back about the role of protests in democracy. You haven't come out explicitly and stated it, I don't think, but you seem to be implying that protests are pro-democratic. This participant asks, is it possible that protests are representing a minority opinion and are kind of ignoring standard democratic change processes?
Yeah, protesters are a minority. They always are. Even these very large, massive protests. Our own surveys suggest that at most in a city population, you'll get 10% of the city taking part. Whereas if you had an election and 10% of people showed up, that's really bad turnout. So in the sense of sort of inclusiveness of participation, elections are much closer to what we have in mind with democratic participation. That said, there are a number of benefits to protests that can be helpful to democracy. Now, what's not the case is that protests are always, the protesters are always going to be protesting in favor of something that one agrees with, or that that say liberal-minded people would agree with. Not at all. But the same can be said of elections. Elections sometimes bring to office people who, perfectly fair, free and fair elections bring to office people who may be anti-democratic. So you can't really judge them based on the content of the demands. I think it's more important to think about what function do they play. So at a minimum, you could I think protests have to be defended sort of like on the same grounds that James Madison defended faction, or sort of said, look, you might not like faction, but if you had a government that stamped it out, the cure would be worse than the illness. You would need vast repression. Same thing with protests. I mean, you would need a very repressive society to stamp out protests. But I think a more positive case can be made for them. One of the things that's interesting about protests is that because they're costly, because they're harder to do, harder to take part than elections in general, there's almost always a big part of the population that still agrees with people who are protesting, even if they don't come out. And so what protests tell you is that you've got some part of the population that cares a lot because it's hard to do. Another problem with elections is that there's sort of a long time lapse between when a government comes in and when it can be held accountable at the end of its term, whereas protests are sort of happening in real time, that you can have people responding much more quickly and readily. Now, it's also true that protests by their very nature can be an inconvenience, and in fact, that's part of the point of them. And if you try to take away all the inconvenience causing issues, the blocking of streets and that sort of thing, you're really kind of taking away the ability of protesters to gain attention. On the other hand, it can be really a pain to have your streets blocked and so on. So there's a kind of a balancing that has to happen, where protesters are allowed. They're allowed to cause, at least minor inconveniences, to say, here we are, we care, this is what we're worried about, without, sort of bringing things to a full halt and not letting people do their work or children go to school and the like.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think we only have time for one more question. So I think this one could be an interesting one to end on. In thinking about the costs of abstention, it's hard to identify what that really is, what that feeling inside of you that you described when you sit in an idling car. When someone doesn't act on their anger or the other feelings that they feel, what personal good have they lost? Is it self-respect, self-identity, sense of community, or something else?
Oh, yeah, that's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, whoever wrote that question. I think it can be all of those things. It can be a sort of a loss of a feeling of a loss of an opportunity to connect with other people who care a lot about the same thing that you care about. I know that here in the U.S. with I think one of the factors that fed the size of the Black Lives Matter protests is that people had been stuck at home and had been very individuated, and obviously there was much anxiety and fear and inconvenience and economic hardship. And so that feeling of wanting to not just to say, I'm really mad about this is the kind of society I want to live in, add to that they wanted to do that with other people. I'll to put a personal twist on it, my 16-year-old son was desperate to join the protests here in Chicago. We were concerned that there would be some dangers related to that. So we agreed on, okay, we'll make some extra donations to good organizations, and he was involved in the research whom to make a donation to. But it's not the same. It's not that same. I think it's very effective. It can be very helpful to make donations, financial donations over the internet, but that's very different from actually being with other people and kind of in a more social way, communicating. And I do think that's part of what kind of cost of abstention is about. It's about those approach emotions that make you want to join with other people and express opinions.
Well, that's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because a couple questions had come in that were seemingly on the personal side of people wanting to go out and support protests, but also weighing those costs of the risks of COVID. But I don't think we have time to dig into that anymore. So I just want to thank you, Professor Stokes. It has been fascinating. And I will turn it over to Tom to close us out.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you so much, Professor Stokes, for sharing your knowledge and insight with us tonight. So on behalf of the University of Chicago Alumni Office, thank you all for joining us. We know you have many challenges and demands for your time and attention right now, and we appreciate your interest. You may now disconnect.